We're live.
Hello, how are you guys doing? It's good to see you. That means that if you can see us and we can see you on Twitter, it's Monday, it's H2HChat, and it's noon Pacific Standard Time. It's 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I'm not gonna go through all the time zones around the world. You guys can figure out the time zone that is most appropriate for you. But what I will say is, welcome back to H2H. And I would love to, first off, before we get into talking to you about our guest, I would love to just say, what's up, Susie? How are you doing?
I am doing very well. I'm very well. Exceedingly excited for today's chat. Should be very fun. Gonna try and keep a straight face. Don't think it'll be possible. But so how are you? You just did your marathon in Vegas.
I did a half marathon.
Sorry,
but
half marathon.
it felt like a marathon, and it felt like 3 marathons actually.
That'd be
All
6 half
packed
marathons?
into, yes, it felt like 90 half marathons packed in one half marathon. And so yeah, that was fun. I cannot use the toilet this morning, and I can't stand up, but otherwise everything's fine. I had a good time.
Rock on.
Yeah, so thank you. Really excited here to introduce our guest. So awesome to be able to introduce him because we kind of sort of just met, but we in Dublin, Ireland, and we met at a pub, and we knew of each other online, and it was a random coincidental meetup of friends coming together in real life from digital to the physical world last week in Ireland, or a couple weeks ago. So David, welcome, David Nihill, right?
Close enough, yeah, Nihill.
Nihill. Is the I strong or weak?
It is the wackiest Irish name in history, so even Irish people screw that one up, so don't worry. Never mind Safeway employees here. Nobody can pronounce that one.
So David is an author, he's a columnist, he is the founder of FunnyBizz SF. He runs an awesome conference, and he is just an awesome dude. So welcome, David. How are you doing?
Very good, thanks very much, and I like the way we got straight off the bat without succumbing to Irish stereotypes whatsoever, and then admitted we met in a bar late at night. That's good.
It's
yeah.
true.
It's a small world in Dublin.
It could go in so many different directions.
It could, and you can't mention any of them right now.
Or can I? So tell me, David, tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Yeah, sure. So it's a bit of a wacky story. As you know, the book I just finished that I wrote is called Do You Talk Funny, which was me getting over a fear of public speaking that I've always had by pretending to be a stand-up comedian called Irish Dave and crashing as many shows and festivals as I could, which does not sound like a good plan, but it worked out all right. And along the way, I met a lot of people who are struggling to create really great content in one way or another. My original background was marketing, but with Crash and Comedy, I was meeting all these comedians and writers all of a sudden who had a very good skill set, and the business was sometimes missing or sometimes couldn't afford to pay for it to have a whole team of professional talent. So FunnyBizz Conference, the writing platform, all that kind of grew out of the public speaking experiments. And I did not start that voluntarily. A friend of mine suffered a spinal cord injury. I suggested hosting a charity show for him, not the best plan I've ever had, and they insisted I host it. Like, they didn't go to college with me in Ireland, so they didn't know I was the mess of a guy, like, shaking and heart racing and sweating like a lunatic before I took the stage. So it kind of set off a whole weird sequence of events just from that one night.
Well, so you were telling me just before we got on about the book process, and your book is just you self-published it, and now it's being published again. But tell us a little bit about the book, how you got into it, and how that went for you. But first, we're going to unmute him. This is where this is kind of funny. David is muted.
Yes.
I'm thinking this is not part of being funny.
Yes. No.
Isn't that
Let's
weird?
see. That is really weird. David, you got to click the. Let's
See
see.
if David, you can unmute yourself.
Only you can do it, David.
I can do it. I can do it.
Yay!
Thank you. So they missed all the Irish stereotypes.
And then that's when you say, and that's all I have to say about that.
Yeah, no, that's finished. I mean, I've been very clear. I've been forthright. We had 3 great points, concepts, and that was a strong ending. So thank you. It's been
emotional. It was
emotional.
your best story ever, and we were so excited.
Yeah, no, it was, and I will never share that again. Thanks for muting me. I will say the whole time on the screen it just kept saying Bryan Kramer muted you, and I was like, is that the same Bryan Kramer that's sitting in front of a half-naked photo there on the other end that he hasn't acknowledged yet?
I haven't acknowledged it because let's take a break right now and talk about what's all behind us. David, you go first.
Behind me, I'm very emotionally attached to this plant, actually. But apart from that, not got none. But I think you win this, so let's get to it.
Sorry, you're way more interesting, Bryan.
Let me show you the magic of Las Vegas.
You wanted to do that in your TED Talk, apparently, but they weren't allowing it in there in the slide deck.
I tried.
Tried to carry it back behind him. I can witness. I was there. You know, this is his moving backdrop that we try to carry everywhere he goes.
Except it was me. Oh yeah.
So they got to hear you telling how we met in a bar, and I did not get to deny anything and distance myself from Irish stereotypes that I was in a bar late at night doing any form of business or saying hello. They missed that. I was just talking to myself.
Yeah, they completely missed it.
Cool.
So let's start over from the beginning. How did you tell us about your book and what got you writing it, and now it's being republished by a publisher?
Yeah, it is. So what does not sound like the world's best plan? I decided to overcome a fear of public speaking by pretending to be a stand-up comedian. I guess my underlying thought was that they are the true masters of public speaking. If you look at Malcolm Gladwell's like 10,000 Hours, they're on stage more. I like making people laugh. I just went to pieces when I had to do it publicly on stage. So pretended to be this guy called Irish Dave for a year, fairly famous in Ireland, not really. And got into a lot of clubs and festivals here in the US and wrote a book about it. And subsequently along the way met a lot of people who were helping business create content or doing marketing copy for them or writing on the social media and also kind of realized that business sometimes strayed away from those core building blocks, the same thing that underlies comedy and the same truths, and started FunnyBizz Conference, started a writer platform along the way, wrote the book, self-published it, then partnered with a publisher to bring it back out again, so I had to re-record it and rewrite it and update it, and I'm dyslexic, so that was a process in itself. It was me trying to dictate it originally, but when you have an Irish accent and you're dictating a book, it does not go too well because it doesn't understand anything. So it's just me locked in a room shouting at myself and people like, is he okay out there? Is he still abusing Dragon Dictate? But yeah, ultimately I put it out as an e-course originally to kind of test the idea and actually get some money, so enough to produce the book and build a bit of an audience that way without me having to promote myself, because obviously no one had heard of me. So yeah, it was an interesting process, a lot of learning.
How do you get into comedy?
Yeah, it wasn't a good plan. It was a friend of mine suffered a spinal cord injury, and his insurance, as we were talking about with the race just before I went in there, when I did a half marathon in a bit of a protest to the cost of his spinal cord injury, the wheelchair wasn't covered, and we were like, well, we need to raise funds for this guy. It just so happened I knew a touring headlining comedian who used to be my next door neighbor. I asked him to do the show. All my American friends knew nothing of my fear of public speaking and that I went to absolutely pieces on stage. So they're like, well, this is your idea. You have to host it. And I nearly laid an egg just on the thought of having to do that. So I went off and I basically tested out some material and stories in the world of stand-up comedy. My theory was if I did a little bit of practice before I went on stage in one of the toughest public speaking environments, I'd probably be pretty okay. I was a big fan of AJ Jacobs and Tim Ferriss and these guys who've kind of gone deep into topics or wrote about it for a year or applied the 80-20 principle. And I was like, well, maybe I could do this with public speaking and comedy.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was it didn't sound like a good plan, but it worked out okay.
So when it's interesting because well, first of all, background's interesting, and I applaud you for doing some awesome work, especially with you know, the ability to transcribe through voice your thought process and get this out into a book. That's no easy feat. I'm definitely interested in now the humor side. You know, we've, as you know, and I think we got connected originally through Brian Carter or Brian and Tim Washer and
Yep.
A bunch of people there in that group. So, but what is your feeling on humor in marketing? When is it appropriate and when is it not appropriate? And I say that with naked people behind me.
Yeah, you do. From a position of authority. Honestly, I think if done well, it can always be appropriate. Like, there's no one's like, oh, stop sending me that humorous content. Like, do away with that. I have no interest in that. I need some facts and, you know, widget examples here. I mean, it becomes inappropriate when you take too strong a stance on it that isn't neutral anymore and stray away from universal truths. So I think a great example of that is Airbnb in the last few weeks. Put out a very controversial marketing campaign that was very much an opinion. Like, it was too much of a stance on something. It wasn't sitting on the fence. It wasn't making fun of something in a lighthearted manner. You know, it didn't have a potential to be universally appealing. And I think comedy can go down that road when you touch on something that's a sensitive topic, and they did, without highlighting a real universal truth to it that appeals to both sides. And I think that's when it comes inappropriate. Like, you'll notice late night TV guys go out of their way to make fun of a person's actions, but not a person. Like, they want to stay on the fence at the end of the day to appeal to the widest audience. I think it becomes risky when you know, it's very off tone with your own company or your beliefs, or it's not appealing to the widest market possible. You do run that risk.
Yeah, I remember that campaign with Airbnb and, you know, the bus shelter, bus stop ads, and that certainly was a misstep. And that's the thing about comedy is, you know, and you know, there should have been some smart people behind it saying, no, don't do that. But regardless, most comedy is, in my opinion, and correct me if I'm wrong, and I'd love your take on this, but it's a risk. Everything's a risk in life, but comedy is an even bigger risk because you don't know who it's going to offend, you don't know where they're going to take that, and you don't know how it's going to be perceived. So, you know, especially when you're dealing in business. I mean, there's one thing to stand up on stage in front of a lot of people and, you know, be able to swear, you know, but when you're dealing in business, that's such a different animal.
Well, yeah, and I think there's two facets to that. Number one, every company tends to have a guy within the company, like Bob from accounting, who's funny occasionally when he gets hammered at the Christmas party, and they're like, let's let him write the copy. He's funny, and you're like, all right, like, no training, no background, no skills, can work occasionally, but the risk factor there is too high if you pursue that. So it's always nice to get someone who knows what they're doing. But two, if your comedy is very visibly with the intent of being funny, you run that risk. But if your comedy is telling a story and that story just happens to be humorous and engaging, there's no risk point there anymore because people are not going to go, they don't see that you're working for the laugh line. So the same principles apply in comedy on the stage actually and producing content and advertising. When you're just telling a story and it happens to have a nice quirky twist, people are still appealed, they're engaged by the story. They still like hearing the story. But if you have that moment where you're like, we're trying to be funny, this is really witty, Jerry Seinfeld style, impactful writing, I mean, that's really hard to recreate, then that risk multiplies significantly. But if you stick with a story, most of the time you can be okay because there isn't that aha moment where people are either like, that's funny or that's terrible. Like, you're not visibly putting in his effort anymore. So if you stick to the narrative of a, you know, it's much more human in its approach from you guys' point of view. There you go. But it is, you know, it appeals to human nature, whereas if you put out an opinion there, like, I said it again. I'm going to avoid that one now. But I mean, what Airbnb did was very much put out an opinion, and if you put out an opinion, even if it's wrapped in comedy, once it's an opinion, our human nature is to argue with it. So somebody's going to argue with it. But if it's a story, it's more universally appealing, and maybe your laugh isn't as big, but the risk factor is reduced, and the overall benefit tends to work well for all. And I would advise that to anybody crafting content. Don't be visibly trying to be funny. Make it fun. Tell them a story. So worst case scenario, they remember the story. And don't be going for those very visible punchlines unless you have somebody with those skills on your side writing those for you, and not Bob from accounting, as lovely as he may be at the Christmas party.
Yeah. Bob with the stapler downstairs? Is that the same Bob?
Yeah, I was probably Bob for a long time, so I don't want to make fun of him too much. That was probably me. But thankfully, I've got
So,
some better wisdom over the years.
and a bigger stapler. So when you're working on, and because you own a really interesting company, you have writers that take already written content, and if I'm not mistaken, and they take that content and make it, I don't know if you could say funny, or they take it and they make it more humorous.
Yeah, more. I mean, the key metric we go for there is more engaging, more light-hearted in tone, more conversational in tone. But sometimes it's funny. Like we've rewritten white papers and things, and sometimes I'd be like, "Oh my God, I've never rewritten a white paper. I've never reread a white paper on communications like 9 or 10 times." Never
Yeah.
happened, and still laughing at it. But yeah, we don't create the content. We much rather people actually create it, because you'll know yourself when you're writing a book or you're producing something. You go to get as much information in as possible, and it's very hard to switch hats then and try and look at that in a more lighthearted moment. But if you're putting that out somewhere like Facebook, where people go expecting a level of entertainment, then you too are expected to be the entertainment. And I guess that's our special skill set, is we have guys look at it and lighten it up a bit. And in comedy speak, they punch it up, but they just try and insert some humor and try and develop the narrative a little bit more, which is something that's very hard to do. Like even when I'm writing my book, if I give my book, even though it's on humor and my life, to a comedy writer, he will make the whole thing better with a very different perspective. I'd be scared to do that. But I know he would. Any of the writers we have, I asked one of them just for a few comments one day, and he basically rewrote my book and made it 50 times better. I was like, okay, we're not talking anymore. I can't use any of this stuff, but because I wanted it to be my own voice, I guess, with a book. But your content, it's really nice to have somebody else jump in on that and go, oh, you missed a really easy one here. Like, this is nice and engaging. There's already stuff in the media this week about it. You know, you have a wave to ride here.
So, what do you, when you're looking for like, what do you believe is just good, solid comedy in business? And actually, I want to be even more specific. Not in B2C, but in companies that are selling relationships. You know, there's so many people out there that are trying to build a relationship and build it over time. We're on social media. We're trying to engage. We're trying to get people to understand who we are as people, and then you know, hopefully they'll want to do business with us, right? And part of that is injecting personality, and part of that personality, I think, is humor. So what's your take on how to inject that right amount along the way throughout business you know, marketing?
Well, I think it just depends on your own personality and how much you like to put it out there. But you'll find that once you start doing it, you'll get into it. Like if you start selling gifts instead of a long email, and it just to expose your emotional state, or I follow up a lot of the time just with a funny image that says everything, and I don't put 2 words on there. And when we put that out to B2B marketing, like when we were looking for sponsors at one stage for a conference, we had I think it was 42% opening rate for emails that were basically cold emails, just by putting humor in them and just by lightening it up in places that people weren't expecting that. Even at the end of your email, if you literally write on it on an email blast, like, why am I on this list? Unsubscribe here. You're on this list because people told us you're funny and you like to laugh. Not true. Click unsubscribe here. I mean, nobody's going to unsubscribe to that. But just any little twist like that, anywhere that you can put it in. Like even on the back of my book, I have a reference from my mother saying, this book is great. I haven't read it yet, but like David drew a penguin when he was a child, and the propensity for creativity was there. And like that's little surprise in that element that you're breaking the sequence, and you're like, oh, cool, there's a bit of this guy's personality in that. And I think you can put that, whether it's B2C or B2B, you can build that in there. And I think you just have to have a lighthearted take on the problem you're trying to solve, and stick to a story narrative first. So go for fun over funny. Start with that story narrative, and often that narrative of why you're doing what you're doing comes from a pain point. And I hate even using that word, pain point, but you'll see a lot of the better B2B campaigns came from that pain point. What are you solving? And instead of you listing a bunch of benefits, you take the flip side of that, and you're like, what are all the really frustration points for the customer? And if I want to create content, I'm just going to focus on all those frustration points, because that's where the humor is. So even with the example I gave of me trying to write a book, the humor in there is me dictating that, and you picturing me shouting at a microphone trying to dictate into Dragon Dictate with an Irish accent. I mean, for me, that's a painful memory. It cost me like days and weeks of my life to shout at this microphone and try and have somebody dictate it and start the whole process. But in there, there's always an element of humor. I think it's just bringing that out within a story narrative and just hiding that moment where you're visibly trying to be funny and just work your personality into your work. And I think the last time we ran FunnyBizz conference, we had a number of speakers that I know you're friendly with, like Jason Miller and a few other guys who put their personality all over their content. And they're not afraid to do that, and they get rewarded for doing it. People are like, oh, there's really a bit of you on this page, and you're showing a bit of your emotion, and you're telling me the things you like outside of work. And I think that's the friendship you're trying to develop, and that's the relationship you're trying to develop, is that you guys actually have things in common out of work, and you want to know a bit more about people. Like, Ireland's very good for that. We'll never go up to you in a bar where we met and go, so what do you do? Like, you know, what are you doing here? It's like, who are you, and what do we have in common, and then maybe we can help each other down the road. But your content is the same thing. Like, it's not like, who are you, what are you doing? It's like, hey, what do we even common? You just ran a half marathon. I had a, you know, painful story about running a half marathon that we were talking through before, and those connection points become humanized very, very quickly. So I think it's up to you. It's up to the individual person. If you feel quirky and funky and like being fun, do it. Nobody's ever going to hold it against you.
So that was my next question. Is there's a lot of people. A lot of people that are listening here that, and not just listening, there's a lot of people out there that I'm sure will watch the replay or are interested in how to, you know, there's classes on this kind of stuff. There's a way to build up your humor repertoire. Say that 10 times. Repertoire. There's different ways that you can, you know, learn the skill of humor. Part of it is practice, and the other part is maybe something else. What is that? How do I be more funny?
How do you be more funny? Yeah, a real easy question. Thankfully, you're sitting in front of a half-naked poster, so you're giving us loads of ammunition today. But I mean, in general, I think it's just mining your own stories for a lot of stuff that you've probably forgot about and retelling those stories in a shorter, most effective form. And I think that's where a lot of people suffer when it comes to producing content, or it comes to vocalizing their thoughts on stage or in a business presentation. That nobody in a business crowd has ever gone, shut up, get off stage, that is terrible. Why is he still saying so many words up there? Nobody has ever forced that conciseness on them like a comedy audience would do. And I'm not saying for anyone to go do live comedy, but I'm just saying to record what you're saying. Like, don't just put it out there, talk it through with a few people, get some feedback, consciously write it out. All great comedians, all great humorists, all have one thing in common. A lot of them weren't born funny, they get funnier along the way, and all of them become good writers along the way. So if your audience is listening, and anyone's listening, and you're like, you know what, I'm one of those unfunny people. Like, if I ask a room full of people in America who thinks they're unfunny here, a lot of people will put up their hand. If I ask the same question in Ireland, nobody will put up their hand. They all think they're hilarious, but they're not. I mean, we all have that little bit of humor within us. Nobody's just ever trained you how to put that out and retell something that you found funny in the shortest, most effective form. So I think the key to starting to be funny a bit is just embrace your quirky self. Start with your own personal stories, because then you're going for fun instead of funny. Like, build those personal stories into your content. If you don't have your own stories that are funny, build your customers' pain points and a frustration when they were using a beta version of your product, or they're using a competitor's product. What drove them nuts? What were the funny email interactions you had with them in the start? Like, what was the weirdest cold call you ever had? What was the weirdest client you ever had? Like, we all have stories in there. And now it's just a matter of picking out the key funny part and stripping out ruthlessly the amount of words that you need to use to get to that funny part of the story. I think that's the downfall of a lot of people when they're trying to be funny, at least in a content-wise. It's just too many words. It's just, it's brevity is levity. And I won't often quote English people. They're not my words, they're Shakespeare's, but I get that one in there. Brevity is levity, but worth remembering in humor because it's very key.
So that's a good start, brevity. I like that. So have you heard that there's this joke about some people in prison, right? That and they've been there for a while, and this new guy comes into the prison, and he tells he asks the guy, you know, what it's like being here, and he said, here, let me show you, and he shouts out a number, and everyone starts laughing. So he shouts out 17, everyone starts laughing. And then and he's like, what was that? He said, we've been here for so long that you just shout out numbers, and it's the number of the joke. So then he shouts out another number, everyone starts laughing, and they all know which joke that one is because they've all been there so long. So the guy shouts out the new guy shouts out a number. He says 62, and no one laughs. And the guy next to him, he says, well, some of us can tell a joke and some can't. And it's kind of, I know it's dumb, but some of us can.
As long as you realize it. No, I'm just joking.
Let's see. I will try. So the thing is that how do you tell what was your thinking on how to tell a story? So
yeah, I think
what's the story that comes out that helps that to happen?
Yeah, I think it's just so. I mean, the joke you just told there, for example, it's very clear that it is a joke, that it isn't your story. You weren't in the prison. It's introducing that element of relatability from you might be okay. It's very clear that you might not want to talk about being in the prison. No, but it's that element of relatability needs to come right out at the start to draw the audience in. And I think the key in a great story is allowing the story listener to see themselves within your story. You want to invite them into your shoes and create a picture in their mind that they're in your shoes. So that one, for example, isn't super relatable. I haven't been in prison. I don't know anyone who's in prison, thankfully. I'll have to go back through the contents now. But nobody puts that on LinkedIn, like in prison. We'll be back to professional profiles.
Well, it just appeared in our Twitter stream. So we are now talking about prison on H2HChat.
Nice, you started it. But I would say you set that up story. Like that has to be a universally appealing statement to draw people into the start net. So if I tell a story about one time I was in China, I've lost most of the people originally, but if I say, hey, it can be unusual and uncomfortable being in a new place, this one time I was in China, now you're inviting them to tap into their own memory bank about a shared common experience. So if I say being in isolation can be a pain, or being by yourself can be lonely, and then you go into telling a story about prison, okay, not ideal, but you're ideally aiming to set up and give yourself an excuse to tell the story that's immediately relatable to your audience. And you become more memorable by doing that, because not only do they remember your story, but they remember themselves within your story. That's the most powerful thing I think you can do in storytelling. Starting in the action is a key in telling that story itself, and I think every great movie, every great series, any great plot you've ever seen, they don't start on the way to the mountain. They start at the top of the mountain, work backwards, and explain why everybody's there. And a great piece of advice, Bill Grunfest is a great Golden Globe winning writer that we had speak at FunnyBizz, and he always says every story in history is the exact same structure. Who wants what, and what stops them from getting it? That's it. Like no matter what you watch on TV, no matter what movie you watch, no matter what narrative you have, if you're doing B2B or B2C with your customers, who wants what stops them from getting it? And now you just need to put meat on the bones of that story.
Yeah, I love that. Real quick, everyone out there, make sure we've got some great questions coming in. I saw Alan and a couple other people throw some questions out, but definitely make sure to throw your questions at #H2HChat, because after this next question, I'm going to be passing the baton over to Susie, where she's going to be taking your questions in and re-questioning them or reposing them over to David. So #H2HChat. Throw some questions out. He's going to be taking them and making them into answers. That's how it works. It's a question.
I'm not going to reference prison either, no matter. There's going to be questions coming in.
There's no question about that. We will not talk prison anymore. So here's my kind of, before I pass the baton over, last thing I wanted to talk to you about was how to build how comedy in community can happen. So we've talked about individual comedy. We've talked about people in comedy. We've talked about building a story. We've talked about business and comedy. But now there's that kind of, I don't know if you call it the last element, but how comedy can create community and how community can create comedy. How do you see that working now and in the future?
Yeah, it's funny because community is becoming such a big part of marketing that those elements are very much now intertwined. So as people look for stories to tell, they're engaging their community now a lot more than they ever were. So in Silicon Valley, as you know, a big job title and Ari all of a sudden is community manager. It's a position we didn't see before. It's one that's now not just a single person. It's often a team of people in the larger companies, and they're mining for content within their users. And when they get good cases, that now becomes the content that they're putting out. A lot of the time, there's a humor element within that content. Like Lyft are doing it constantly. Like, look at one of our drivers. This is what he did. Isn't it so cool? Isn't it funny? And they rebrand it and they remake it, but they're effectively telling stories within their community. And of course, they draw out the ones with the humor within those, and they're crowdsourcing that humor a lot of the time. Like the community aspect now means that you have a huge group of people to tap into. You're like, hey, I don't have anything funny. We don't have anything set this week. Anybody got any crazy, any stories from working with, Lyft passengers, for example, if you're Lyft or whatever you're doing this week? And I think Beta Brand in San Francisco is a really great example of that. And Chris Linnan, the CEO and founder, I know well because we used to live together when he started that company originally. And they crowdsource all their humor, all stories, all products. I mean, the images you'll see on the website. And Chris's story is told by more keynote speakers than I've ever seen before. Like the amount of guys making money off being a keynote speaker and just talking about stuff Chris Linnan does with Beta Brand. But the stuff is that unique. He's that great at getting media attention, but he's also built a community of impassioned followers because their humor, their lives, their experiences are his company. And they're very much intertwined. And I think that's the key thing now with community, marketing, and humor all building into one. They're all struggling to get content or produce great content or feeling the pressure to put humanized content out there, and they tap into their community to find it.
Or maybe I used the wrong button.
Yeah. No,
I was wondering when you were going to break that out.
So this
you
is a
should
good
have had
time.
that after your prison joke.
There you go.
Yeah, no, for prison it's... So I'm going to pass the baton over to my lovely co-host Susie McCarthy. She's the one with the red hair, in case you guys were not aware of where she was and who she is. You are. I'm kidding. So Susie, I'm going to put you in, or I should say, David, I'm going to put you into some very awesome, qualified hands and pass you over to Susie and the community. And they've got some great questions coming. I may chime in from here and there, but I leave you with Susie.
Cool, thank you.
All right, we have some awesome questions coming in right now. Please keep them coming, guys. I put a poll, Twitter poll, been experimenting with it the past couple weeks. Yes, we put a Twitter poll out there asking whether you, as not you, David, but you, H2HChat community, would personally advise a brand to use humor in a marketing strategy. So right now I have lots of yeses, but tons of qualified yeses, and I'll be going over those at the very end to kind of generate a bit of conversation. So please answer that. And yeah, so let's go ahead and get started. First of all, I have to say what I'm getting out of this is clearly I need to hire a comedy writer because to amp up my blog content. I love that concept of that comedy writers, they are so amazing.
Cool, yeah. I mean, they can make anything funnier for the most part. But the nice thing is, even if you just take their lead or read some of their stuff or follow their structure, I mean, you can apply their techniques yourself without really needing one, to be honest. I mean, your blog is all about you. So you just need to tap into those little quirky, cool stories that a comedian would be like, yeah, that's it. Like, that's the funny thing. Let's get this out there.
Well, I think that could definitely work. Okay, so let's get started. A lot of conversation around this has really had to do with audience. So especially when we're talking about marketing. So I kind of want to move the conversation towards that. Let's get started with Ursula's question. So she says, actually it's kind of a dual thing. Her comment is, when you use humor in marketing, you really need to know your audience. Something, for example, very relevant to us, right? If that's funny in the US, won't work in the UK, vice versa. Alan Berkson kind of puts this in question form. He says, how do you manage cross-culture and humor when it doesn't always translate? So,
yeah, it's true. The funny thing at the moment is what's becoming funny is becoming a little bit more universally appealing. Like before, you just watched TV programs, they were for the States. You watched, Irish comedy, very different in Ireland. But now all of a sudden it's being dominated by your Twitter feed or your Facebook feed, and it's forcing the humor to become a little bit more transcendent. If you're amplifying that humor or you're paying for it in a marketing campaign, then you can very much put it on tone and use the words that your audience would need to speak. But a lot of the time you can sit on the fence a little bit more and not aim for being hilarious, just aim for being fun instead of funny, not for hilarity. And you don't need to work as much as hard with that if you still have a story narrative within that content. So what are you trying to communicate with what you're doing? But I think it is very important that it's tailored to your market. If you're running a specific ad campaign, you want to use the words that have the most universal appeal. But if you're not, and you're just putting it out there with a hidden hope that you'll get the widest audience, it's just keeping those tones as neutral as you can. And just be yourself within it. Put out there. If it makes you laugh, like, it'll probably make somebody else laugh as long as you put it in the right tone. And put it out there. I think if you like it, if you believe in it, like, put it out there. Don't put out stuff that bores you and it won't bore somebody else. I mean, you're never going to win over 100% of the people, no matter how transcendent it is. So, you know, aim for 30%, make 30% happy, and you'll be doing pretty good. Make 30% laugh, and you're doing really good.
So I think to drill down part of what you've been saying here, it sounds like there's a part, potentially, when we think of comedy, we're thinking of, you know, something maybe tongue-in-cheek. Maybe we are thinking about Seinfeld, that types of things, and that is the comedy that is very high stakes. That's not the type of comedy you're talking about.
No, and I think that's where a lot of comedians struggle a little bit in the US when they come out, because they're forced to fit into a very short narrative that's witticisms, that's dictated by a 5-minute television appearance, which often defines the launching point for their career. So they're forced to be extremely, extremely concise and tight with words, but once they hit that barrier, they get more stage time, they're filling an hour. They don't have an hour witticism most of the time, so they tap into their own lives a little bit, and in doing so, they tell their own stories. And they start introducing narratives into their work. By doing so, they become more memorable, and people actually like them a lot more for doing it. So it's funny, in Ireland we move more, we don't have the TV slot appearance, and we're a lot more additional with our words and with our emotions, and we run around the stage. We're like a sweaty mess by the end of a stand-up comedy performance. Very different than the US, but it's easier for your mind to remember that story element. And comedians here, they end up developing it, and then they're said to find their voice 6 or 7 years into the world of comedy. All of a sudden, where it's, oh, look at him, he found his voice, but realistically, he's just telling his story. It's like writing. So when I wrote a book, I dictated it. So, like, you don't have to find your voice. That is my voice. Like, if I was just talking, that's the content is going to be very similar. So I think it's the same with comedy. I think it's the same in marketing. That it's the same in your Super Bowl advertisement and commercials. So the ones that resonate the most always have an underlying story narrative. So there's been a number of works of research analyzing that and breaking it down, even when they were funny, or if it was just a Budweiser commercial, the dog went missing. Who wants what stops them from getting it? Same as earlier, his dog went missing, he wants his dog back, he gets all emotional when the dog turns up with the horses. Has a narrative to it. And I think whether it's funny or not, it still needs that narrative. Unless you're just playing off wordplay. So Lyft, again, to use a good company in San Francisco, they had advertising campaign last week all over the bus stops, and it said after Barty, like instead of after party, and it was a map of the BART public transport system, but it was made to be all Lyft run. So basically, when you go out and you party and you get drunk, don't get BART anymore, get Lyft to get home. And it was just a little wordplay. It's something that your audience can resonate with. But in that, there's no narrative. Like if it's just word puns and plays on words, is pretty easy. Doesn't, you know, that's universally appealing. I think it's mixed. I think you can tailor it if you want, if you're running a specific campaign, but I don't think you need to feel that need anymore. Because you're out there on Facebook, you're going to be appealing to as many, you know, in the English-speaking world as you can. Probably won't limit it to just the States.
Yeah, I like that. That's a very good point. And so this plays a bit into Darren Button's question. So he brings up, he says, do social platforms such as Periscope, so now we have live streaming, right? Allow us to show more humor in our brands. So streaming comedy, for example, as opposed to just the written word.
Yeah, I 100% think so. I think Periscope is a very strong narrative for those who have a lot to say and a story to tell all of a sudden. And you can't really just bust out witticisms on Periscope. If you're live streaming and there's no real filter on it for quality, it just becomes you. Imagine like giving a TED speaker, like Brian's done a TED Talk, obviously you're forced to be very concise over a short period of time. Periscope him for an hour, and you're going to get a very different story as those things come out to fill the silence a bit. And those things that you vocalize in that silence period are often very different than anything you'd write. And that's where you hit gold a lot of the time for comedic terms or for any form of writing. When you vocalize it, it's always different than when you write it. Always, because we have that natural tendency to not like silence, so we just keep going with the story, and you get to little details. And in comedy, it's often in the little details. Like, it's never just, I got in a car. It's what kind of car, what color was the car, because again, you want to allow people to picture themselves within that joke or story. Comedians will go at great lengths and details to really home in on those small details. And when we're unfiltered on things like Periscope, we tend to say all that stuff, and you watch it back and you're like, oh man, I said that. I totally forgot about that. That was cool. And what a comedian will do is log those consciously and create a file on a smartphone or on an app like Evernote, and literally every time they see something funny or vocalize something, or they watch themselves back on Periscope, or they watch themselves back on a podcast or an interview, they're like, oh, that was cool. I said that. I need to remember that. And they will iterate on that and develop that, and then that becomes stuff that they use to create content, whether it's just for comedy or whether it's their own social stream down the road.
So tons of audience research.
Yeah, and they are mining for stuff the whole time. Like when I started this, I had an app on my phone. Nothing was on it. It said funny story file, and it was just a question mark. It's like, and I think I added a few more question marks over the next few weeks. But the funny thing about life is, like, if you start looking for humor, you will find it absolutely everywhere. Like every day, there's an opportunity to something quirky, and you just write it down. And you always have stuff to build your presentations around. And I think we're seeing that with the best TED Talks at the moment, and a lot of the best content, that they're building it around their own human interactions that are very relatable, as opposed to building it around the information. So they get the stories first. Nice. Very nice. I like that applause.
Yeah. Oh yeah, we see that's our funny aspect, right? And it fits in with the human thing.
Yeah, it cuts me off nicely as well. Don't let an Irish person keep talking, so you need those sound effects just to be like, okay, stop, calm down.
Oh, I know how that is. My father is Timothy Patrick McCarthy. Don't get him started. It's an issue. Anyway, so this brings up a really good point, right? Because it's one thing when we're talking about, people, right? And we can talk about things, maybe have a miss, et cetera. But when we're talking about a brand, suddenly the stakes can become bigger, right? So Alan Berkson has another great question. He says, how do you handle it? How would you recommend people handle it, brand handle it, when humor goes awry or people take it the wrong way? Obviously, Johnny Carson had blammo, right? But brand can't necessarily tweet that out unless it's a very specific type of brand.
Well, the nice thing, it's very similar actually to comedy developed in live form as well by a stand-up comedian, is just acknowledging the likely reaction of the audience, what a comedian would call calling the room. So if you do that with what they're likely thinking, like it's terrible, it doesn't go down well, you have to come out and own it and apologize really quickly. And I think every case where that's happened ever, they have come out and acknowledged it really, really quickly. And they say, okay, that sucked. We fired our team that did that, or Bob from accounting's now gone. And we've got a proper creative team. Like, that's not going to happen again. And we recognize that that wasn't good, and you just quickly move on. But if you don't acknowledge that, the likely feelings of the person on the other side of that, the recipient, the person on the other side of the screen, that's when people really turn on you, like if it's silent. So you need to be very responsive in that and own it if you've done something that is misinterpreted. But again, if you stay away from poking fun at weak targets, like if you only ever make fun of people in very high positions of power, like late night comedy shows, and you're not making fun of them personally, it's for their actions, or you're playing on another brand some of the features that they're not missing, if you're looking at it particularly on brand, like what are the pain points, what are the customer frustration points with using their brand versus your brand, then you're not really seen as being too controversial out there. But if you make a statement like Airbnb did, and you put it out there, and you saw they apologized pretty quickly, like, they're a lovable brand for the most part, unless you've leased out your apartment and been thrown out by your landlord. But like most other people wouldn't have a reason to hate them. So the answer down, just own it, own up to it, and quickly move on.
I like that. So someone mentioned, just like all H2H chats, we always seem to come back to this concept of authenticity, right?
Yeah.
Just being yourself.
And it is.
I like that we're doing that.
And acknowledging the likely feelings of the other person is key to that. And I think, I don't like Geico commercials. Everyone's always like, Geico commercials are really funny. I hate that talking lizard. I'm like, lizards, they don't even have them in England. Why does he have a British accent? No idea. But what they've done with their recent campaign is very, very smart, which is basically, Geico, you can't skip this commercial because it's already over. And that is a human behavior that we all do. We're like, oh my God, get rid of this commercial. I don't want to be subject to it. And by acknowledging that, it makes a huge difference. It's to acknowledge the likely feelings of the audience, whether you're doing a good job or a bad job, or how they're treating your content or consuming it. Same thing applies.
I think my co-host apparently also would like some acknowledgement that he's now on a beach.
Yeah,
he's gone tropical. So, give.
It's better than being in prison.
There you go. There you go. We'll give him some applause. Thank you, Bryan. You're adding to our Google Effects bit. So let's talk about when to use comedy, right? Because obviously it's not always. So I have a great question from Mordecai Holtz, who joins us every week from Israel.
Cool.
Love it, Mordecai. Mordecai. He says, how do you integrate humor into content marketing? And then this is what I really want to talk about. How do you know when to use it? What's your advice?
Yeah, it depends on the medium you're going for. It depends if it's your kind of brand, you know. If you're just doing one particular piece of content, you can always experiment with it. And we'll see companies like Optimizely do that a lot. Like, you would not think they're traditionally a funny company, and they can put out some bits of content, and if the engagement is there, they'll continue with it. It really depends if it's on point with your brand or not, with what you're doing in that particular campaign or that particular piece of content. But like, you can't really go too wrong if you lighten up a piece of content. Like, you're not trying to be hilarious. Like, don't write it with the objective of being funny. Just write it with the objective of being more engaging and lightening it up and writing it in the tone of your audience. And then if it's not visible humor, like if you weren't putting yourself out there like you are with a really short joke that you've taken from somewhere else, then, you know, you're not running the same risk. So you can use humor in content marketing all the time. Nobody's ever going to say, stop that. Stop producing that engaging, entertaining content. That's horrible. You need to cut it out. Right. I mean, it does depends on the way you're putting it out with your company. I don't want to get anybody in trouble where they produce something that's very off brand with their company, but you know, you'll know where you're working or not if you're open to embracing that. It just depends on the medium you're putting it out on.
So I think that let's see, we'll do Janet Fout's question. Then I want to get into some of the great responses I've gotten to this polling question. So she says, what about brands who have no sense of humor?
I mean, I love Dice for this one. So like Dice, like software recruiting, tech recruiting. You guys live in the Bay Area. You know Dice. Like, you've seen their photos of half-naked developers, and it's like, you know, hire John, Python developer, and it's a guy in his underpants with his Python snake wrapped around him. And it's eye-catching, and it's hilarious, and it got them a host of attention. And their brand is not funny whatsoever. Like, the key driver, the guy behind that whole campaign, was in their design team. And I think there's no limit to the creativity you can introduce on that one. I mean, you can put it out there. You don't have to be a funny brand to create and use humor, or you just put a unique twist on the way you're doing it already. And that's what we saw with Dice. I mean, their campaigns are everywhere. You know, the idea was from within. It wasn't originally with an agency, and it has a huge amount of success.
So actually, I want to do one more question actually before this one came in from Christy. So she brings up the concept of company culture. So she says, should you include humor only if it fits within your company culture? So once again, kind of authenticity.
Yeah, I mean, there's some great statistics out there on that 98% of CEOs value candidates more that have a sense of humor within them. And there was another book by Kate Wiseman. I'll need to look it up after. But basically, they found that one thing, humor, the CEOs that use humor actually were better CEOs. So one thing they figured out with every great leader had a very good sense of humor. That was something that came through very clear in their research. So, I mean, your company culture is often shaped and built by people, human people, who love humor. And where you're gone are the days where you're those where you're just sitting around. Like, there has to be an element of personality there. You know, there has to be an element of fun for you to keep doing your job. Those of us who are a little bit on the creative side really strive for that. Like, everybody wants to be a bit. Some people think of themselves as creative or not, but like, we're all creative. We all can tap into that side. And I don't think there's it doesn't have to be fully aligned with your company culture to do that. If you're being yourself in work, people will appreciate you being you. And if humor is part of that, all the better for everybody. But the statistics back you up on that. And I think you'll see, like with the LinkedIn CEO, there's a lot of company CEOs, Twitter ex-CEO, they have guys who are very, very fond of using an element of humor, and that trickles down and ultimately produces more creativity, as their reports would have us believe.
I like that. And that actually, so let's get to this poll. So I asked, would you advise a brand, and specifically Twitter handle, to use humor in marketing, or is it too risky? And I have 16 responses. Not bad. 94% yes, 6% no. I have to say, I was actually expecting a little bit more pushback. However, I did get a lot of great comments, and I want to read them out, and maybe we could just talk through a few of them.
Sure.
So Ursula, who brought up the idea of the UK versus US, the first question I asked you, says that's a tough call, especially if a brand has a global reach. It's difficult to universally convey humor or comedy. So once again, Twitter handle. Christine Mikulka says, I find I want asterisks when answering this. Yes, but it needs to fit with your brand voice. So we have that again.
Or your voice. I think we have all these people these days who need to stand apart from their brand a little bit, even as employees. So, and a lot of companies are recognizing that you're not going to be there for life, so you want to express a little bit of yourself when you're in there. And
what about brand handle, though?
Yeah, brand handle's a tough one. I mean, the nice thing is you can test everything these days. So if this is your brand handle, all of a sudden you do need to make a conscious decision whether you're going to do one or the other. But if you haven't really set the tone for what you do online, or you haven't really established an online presence yet, you can test it. And if you're getting good feedback on it, or people are responding well to it, like Paddy Power in the UK and Ireland is a bookmaker. Now, you wouldn't really link what they're doing with comedy, but they from the start just went, we're going to be funny. And everything they do is humor orientated, and it's not done by them internally. They have a team of comedians, comedy writers, and agencies doing it for them. But it's really resonated with people. But in these days, you test everything. You don't even put out a lead page these days. You don't put out your copy without testing it on multiple lead pages. You can do the same thing with a Twitter handle. I mean, you might have that moment where you go to bed and get up in the morning, you're like, oh boy, shouldn't have said that. But if you're focusing on telling a story, and you're not picking on targets, and you're not picking on targets that aren't in powerful positions, and you're not being too controversial, you should be fine. Like, humor is only dangerous if you're really visibly trying to use humor and be a bit of a smartass. Like, telling a story and pointing out a little bit of engagement in something and making it more lighthearted, that doesn't generally have much risk attached to it. And that's the difference. We all think about humor as like Jerry Seinfeld standing on a stage and poking fun at like some group or a minority group or something that could be controversial, but realistically, humor is also just pointing out the fun in things and not just the funny.
Yeah, I like that. And I have noticed when I've done different audience research for some of the clients that I work with, I've noticed UK brands actually seem to be a bit more humorous in general, which is interesting.
We embrace it more, and we don't see the risk element to it. And if someone says something controversial, we don't react to it as much. We're definitely not as politically correct as you guys are over here.
Yeah,
we're getting there.
Well, there's a thing about British comedy too. So I think I like that Ursula brought that up as well. Aldo Margoni actually echoed what you're saying here. He says, I like and appreciate humor. It's definitely worth investigating. He's thinking you can start with a specific campaign or audience. Someone else, so Carrie added a really interesting thing here. She said, I think a humorous handle could be effective, but that it requires good judgment and brand consistency. So
yeah, I mean, you can do it as an offshoot sometimes. So Zendesk is a company that you'd be like, they're not funny. They don't do anything humorous. But one of the alternative, so the most searched term apart from Zendesk a couple of years back was Zendesk Alternative. So people were trying to find some other products instead of use theirs. Zendesk knew this, so they created a fictional rock band called Zendesk Alternative. And when everybody went to this thing, they saw employees from Zendesk playing in this rock band. And it was a whole dedicated site that funneled people back towards Zendesk with a bit of a humor thrown in for good measure. Yeah. So in this essence, that's very offbeat with their brand, but they were able to test it as just one little random experiment within the company. And Optimizely did the same thing. I mean, you'll find their head of experimental marketing has a whole campaign where he's a rapper rapping about like data optimization. Like, it's very off point, but it got a lot of shares and it allowed him to pursue that and say, to take metrics to management, be like, look, there was actually a lot of engagement with this. People are sharing it. Like, can we widen it out a bit? So I think you can test that. You can start a Twitter handle that isn't the official Twitter handle and just retweet. I mean, if I was within a company of marketing and someone stopped me adding humor, I would just create an alternative Twitter handle for fun and see could I get higher engagement than the actual company one by retweeting their posts and just making them a little bit more lighthearted every time. And just now, I'm no Twitter guru. I don't use it much, to be honest, as you'll see it anyway. Like, I don't put out my opinions on there. I'm bad on social media, so I don't want to advise anyone on it. But I do know, I have a friend, for example, he wanted to get hired by Saturday Night Live. So what he did to get a job as a comedian and a writer on there, he started a Twitter handle called Hire Me at Saturday Night Live, and he out-tweeted them. And his tweets got higher engagement rates. Every time they posted something, he reposted it and made it more entertaining, or he wrote his own stuff. And the metrics and the numbers never lied, so he was able to go to them, and they hired him. And the same thing you can replicate within your company. Like, if if I really had extra time on my hands now and I really want to do this, I want to take company press releases that are normally the most boring things in history. And every time someone puts out a press release, I want to have a team of comedy writers rewrite it the next day and prove that we can get much higher engagement rate by putting a bit more personality into something.
I
But
love
yeah,
that.
that's
It's
a
A/B
side project.
testing.
Well, we were
Yeah.
like, PR is broken. Like, stop putting out the same kind of stuff all
Oh
the
yeah.
time. Just make it a bit. So I'm like, that's a pet project that's on a side burner with a few comedic writers. But just test it. You
Yeah.
can test it, and no one's going to hold it against you if you do it as an offshoot, or Twitter, you get permission to do it. Like,
Right.
there's always a way of working that within your company.
Right, absolutely. So this has been great, and I love the response that we have here. And I think, you've gotten a lot of people really thinking about this. Obviously, we are going to direct people to your book. But if people are looking for kind of some tips, right,
Yeah,
on
sure.
how to put this into content marketing,
Yeah.
how to implement this, what would be a few kind of go-tos that they could
Yeah, I mean, on the content side in marketing, we have a site called FunnyBizz with 2z's.co, and there's a number of articles on the blog on there there's one or two of them that are tailored actually for content marketing specifically, with a few of your former guests I think have contributed to that. And on the humor in public speaking, I have a site called 7comedyhabits.com. That's the number 7, and everything on there is focused towards humor, the application of humor, and building a story narrative in public speaking. And the book is called Do You Talk Funny? But yeah, I'm not hard to find. But yeah, there's different things on there, and they're all advising people along it. We run a conference series around it, so we literally get all the people we love in the world that are doing great things in comedy and humor, and we put them on one stage, and we get them to share their story. Like, wow, this company did this. It doesn't sound normal for this company. How did you do it? How did you get permission for it? What were the 4 key learning points? So we've been running that in San Fran and in San Francisco and in New York, and probably in Ireland next year, just because we have lots of pubs there, and it's fun.
Nice.
I get to go home and
Awesome.
see the family. So yeah, I'm not hard to find. There is stuff on funnybiz.co. There's stuff on 7comedyhabits.com as well.
Awesome. I'll tweet out those links. Well, thank you very much. And just so you know, I didn't get to everyone's comments. So if you have a second to
I'll
check
get
them
on there.
throughout the day, there you go. BK,
Lovely.
over to you.
Yeah, hey David, thank you so much for being on the show today. And again, I know we talked about your book, but just one final time, if you can let everybody know where to find you and the best way to either work with you or check out your stuff, check out your conference, that would be great.
Sure, yeah. So funnybiz.co, the conference is on there, the blog post stuff is on there, articles we have a lot of funny GIFs that you can use if you just want to get going within your marketing. At one stage we basically picked a whole host of influencers and we made sure we'd get responses just by using GIFs and no message content whatsoever, and it worked. So people do respond to them. We have our best ones listed on there if you want to get them, or 7comedyhabits.com, and the book is called Do You Talk Funny? And you can get me on Twitter. I'm not very good at it, but I will reply. On
You'll
there,
get some
and
traffic.
yeah. No, I do. I
There.
love the questions, and if we can help, we've gone out of our way to kind of build a community around this of people who are doing it and know how to do it well. And if their tips aren't enough for you, then we can help you. At FunnyBizz, we have a team of comedy writers. So, but I think people can do it themselves for the most part to a certain level. Just don't leave Bob an accountant at it. Get someone who has a real passion for it, and if you can't, just bring in some outside help to do it.
It's awesome.
Well, awesome, man. Thank you so much. We are that is a wrap for today. Thank you once again, David. Really, really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. Nice work on the half marathon again.
Thank you. Appreciate it. You guys don't know this, but Cliff Shot is sponsoring today's show. No, I'm kidding. They're not sponsoring it. I actually just have had so many of these in the last 2 days. These gel things are they're like caffeine shots, and you take them, and I've had so many that I'm like bouncing off the rooftops, but I can't stand up. So I'm like,
you'll start snorting them. Before you know it, you're going to be telling crazy prison stories. Like, that one time I was in prison. They're like, you weren't in prison. Yeah. You're like, oh no, I've been on those Cliff caffeine shots again.
Yeah, I know. I'm like, oh, it's like a drug. You want to suck it out. It's so good.
Oh my God.
But so anyway, thank you guys. Really appreciate it. Susie, thank you once again. Awesome. Love co-hosting with you as always. And everyone out there, thank you for joining us. Next Monday, we are going to be having Shanda from the UFC fighters championship. So they were just in Melbourne this week on the big fight, and the head of social media for UFC is going to be on H2HChat next Monday. So we're going from funny to fighting.
Oh yeah, there's no link between Irish people and fighting whatsoever either.
Being human.
Or pubs, yeah, human.
H2H, human. Humor to fight.
It's going to be good. But thanks again, David, and everyone out there. Really appreciate you guys joining us for another H2H chat. Stick with us. We'll see you soon, and have a good rest of your Monday. Cheers.
Thanks. Bye-bye.